Hello everyone, my name is Mohith. I'm a lead developer advocate here at Salesforce. Welcome to the session on Lightning Web Component Best Practices. I presented this session at TrailblazerDX conference, and on popular request, I'm re-recording the content so that it's available on demand on our YouTube channel. Now before I begin, this is our forward-looking statement. Please make your purchasing decisions based on features that are generally available. With that out of the way, here is the list of agenda for this session. First, we'll cover how to compose your Lightning Web components. So in this section, we'll talk about composition techniques for Lightning Web components. And then we'll look into some of the best practices for building reusable Lightning Web components. Then we'll take a peek into best practices for component communication. Next, we'll take a look at some of the best practices for styling your LWC components. Next, we'll take a look at some of the error handling patterns. And then finally, we'll take a look at some of the performance and the security best practices for building Lightning Web components. Alright, so in this section, we'll learn how to compose a Lightning Web components. Now, in order to understand this, let's start with the fundamental understanding of how an app page in Salesforce is composed. An app page in Salesforce is composed of standard components that Salesforce provides and a set of custom components that you as a developer design and build. Now, custom components that you build should try to use Salesforce-based components as a building block. Before I answer why one should use base components, let me answer what are base components. Base components are a set of components that Salesforce provides that you can use as a building blocks for creating user interfaces. These base components incorporate Lightning design system and they provide improved performance and accessibility. Now you can find more information about all of our base components via our standard component reference guide. The link for this is also shared in the video description down below. Alright, now let me cover some of the best practices around how to compose your components. So when you are building your components, the first thing that you should try to do is ask yourself, can the component that you are building use one of these base components? Again, base components provides a lot of features like abstractions, built-in Salesforce Lightning design system support. You can also custom style them using styling hooks, and also these are accessible. Alright, so the next thing that you would want to follow is see if your organization maintain a set of reusable components so that you can use what is there already existing. Now, if your organization is not maintaining a set of reusable components, you can take initiative to make sure that you are maintaining a library of components. Now, finally, find out if there is an opportunity to build something reusable. So when you are building anything with Lightning component, see if there is an opportunity to make the components reusable and make it available for other developers. Now we'll get into more depth around this in the next section. Alright, so in this section, we're going to look at some of the best practices for building reusable components. Now to explain the concept of reusability, I've taken an example of an app page called Product Explorer from one of our sample apps called eBikes. This app is open source and can be cloned from our GitHub repository. The link for this specific project is shared in the video description right below. Now, if you look at Product Explorer here, let's see how this Product Explorer works before we sort of understand how we have composed this app page. So on the left, we have filters. These filters have different input elements like search key, price, some checkbox fields. Now as a user, I can provide values to these input fields, and you can see that the result that shows different bikes vary based on the filter selection. Now I can also click on one of these bikes and you can see the details of the bike being rendered on your right. Alright, now let's see how we have composed this component. So the first level of how you would want to compose your components and sort of build reusable components is based on functionality. So you can see that we have these filters and these filters can be reusable. Functionally they can be reusable. So we can treat this as its own component. There's a component called product list which shows list of bikes. Now this is a specific functionality, so this could be a component in itself. Finally, we have the detail card component, the bike detail card component or the product detail. As you can see, the product tile here has its own functionality. So altogether we have three different set of components. So the code for the component that shows the list of bikes is here. It uses a directive called for each to loop over the data and then display different bikes using div images and paragraphs. Now the second level that you should think of is in this specific code you can see that the product tile could be reused for this specific component and also it can be reused wherever you need the product tile details. So we can extract that as a component here called product tile and now we are using product tile component instead of repeating over the markup. Alright, now you can add attributes like for example is draggable equals true, a property, so that now this becomes reusable and sort of used anywhere where we also need the draggable functionality. Alright, so let's summarize the characteristics of a reusable component. The first thing is a reusable component is dumb as possible. If you try to incorporate lots of functionality into a reusable component, you will see that you need a lot of modifications when you try to reuse the component. So it should be dumb as possible. The next best practice is make sure you well document the public properties, the public function and events of a reusable component. And finally, make sure that when you are building these reusable components, favor public properties over public methods. And the reason for that is your public properties can be called from different places and the entire re-rendering of the component can happen. While the same functionality in public methods is not possible because you would have to call these methods again and again for the reactivity. So properties by itself makes your component reactive. So you should prefer public properties over public methods. Alright, so the next thing that I want to talk about is component variations. So let's talk about static variations. So what you see here is a desktop view of a component that shows list of opportunities in a tabular format. Now the same component in the mobile has a different view. Now the data is same, but the view of the component differs. So for these type of components that are structurally different, but still you have the same data, make sure to use multiple templates and then use directives. So for example, in this case, I can use a directive called LWC if and conditionally render a list mobile view component. And also, if it is a desktop, I'll render the desktop list component. Again, these two components are just using different, they're using multiple templates here, but in terms of like the data access, they'll use the same method to access the data. Alright, let's talk about dynamic variations. So imagine that you're building a custom model component yourself. And if you're building a custom model component, let's say that components need different functionality and different variations of it.
So for example, as you can see in one use case, we need only text elements as the model body. Maybe in the next one, we need a form element along with some buttons. Maybe in the third one, we need a different form element. So this is a classic example of a component that can dynamically vary. So if you're trying to build a reusable component, then make sure to use slots to create those variants. So here's an example of how to use slot. So my component called name slot has two slots, first name and last name. And you can see that when I'm trying to use this name slot component in a different component, I can replace those slot with the HTML of my choice, as long as I maintain the same names of slot as defined in the name slots here. So in this example, use spam to display the names. I could also use divs here or different form elements. Alright, so in this section, I want to cover some of the best practices for designing components for application builder or an app builder. So the best practices for designing an app builder is to strike a balance between the number of components that you have versus loose coupling. So really when you are composing or when you are building components for app builder, one thing you should always consider is see how many number of components that you are building. What we have seen in the past is developers tend to break their application into many number of components and they sort of loose couple them and assemble with app builder. Now if you have too many number of components on the page which are loosely coupled, then the challenge is that you'll use lots of pub sub events for the communication or LMS, and it decreases the performance of your application. Similarly, if you do not modularize and if you build everything as a monolithic, you'll see that the code is hard to maintain. So it's always striking a balance between number of components that you want to have for an app page and number of components that you want to loosely couple. So as long as you strike a balance between them, you should be achieving that optimized performance of your app page.
Alright, in this section, we're going to discuss some of the best practices for component communication. Alright, now before we discuss the best practices for using events in Lightning Web Components, let's understand various communication types. So the first example here shows communication from child to parent. This happens via events. The next is communication from parent component to the child component. Now this can happen through events, and also you can pass the values from parent to the child via props or properties. Now you'll see later that the best practice is to only use properties if you are passing data from parent to child, not use events. Now there is one more communication type, is if you have components that are loosely coupled and they are not part of the same DOM hierarchy. Those components are called unrelated components, and you can still communicate between these two loosely coupled and unrelated components by using Lightning Message Service or pub sub events. Alright, so let's look at some of the best practices for events if the component is part of the same DOM hierarchy. So to demonstrate the best practice, I have an example of a component called To-Do. To-Do app has a parent component called See To-Do app, and then it has a child component called See To-Do item. Now the best practice is props down and events up. That means if See To-Do item has to communicate to the parent See To-Do app, we use events. And if See To-Do app needs to communicate and send data to the child component, then we use properties. Now to deep dive into the code, there is a whole Trailhead module around this. In this Trailhead module, you can find code examples and learn how to use events for communication from child to parent and how to use properties for parent to child. The link for this module is also shared in the video description right below. When you're using events or custom events to be precise, make sure that you pass only primitive data types in the detail object. So in this example, custom event has a detail property. Make sure that within that you're using only primitive data types and not objects. That's because primitive data types are immutable, so their state cannot be easily changed when they are passed around. So it makes state management easy. So next, let's take an example of component communication when two components, that is the parent and the child, are part of the same shadow tree. In that scenario, you do not need to add the property that you are trying to pass around by using event.detail. Alright, so the next is some of the best practices for events when they are not in the same shadow tree. So for those, make sure you use event.detail, and also make sure that the configuration uses bubbles false and composed false so that the data does not bubble through the DOM and do not cross the shadow boundary. This is the least disruptive type of messaging, and by adopting the security best principle of least privileges, this is the right configuration that you should use for your events. Now let's take an example of a component for cross-DOM communication. In this example, we have 3 different components, and these components are loosely coupled. That means they are also not part of the same DOM hierarchy. They are completely unrelated. So for this, make sure you use Lightning Message Service. Now this is a more complex scenario. So if you have large number of components which have large number of producers and consumer, you might end up in a very complex state of events. Usually these type of applications are difficult to manage in terms of state changes. Now a solution for that is to use a Redux store. Redux is a state management library. As you can see, it simplifies state management. Now there is a sample repo here that I have shared. This has an example code of how to implement Redux for your Lightning Web Components. Again, this is for more complex ISV apps where you have large number of events and state for your app, and when you have that kind of a complex architecture, you can simplify that by using a state management library. Alright, in this section, we'll take a look at some of the best practices for styling Lightning Web Components. Now, before we look at the best practices for styling components, let's understand how CSS works within Lightning Web Components. Lightning Web Components encapsulate and isolates a component style sheets. What this means is your style sheets do not cascade, and they are encapsulated within the component style sheet. Now this behavior can be sort of overridden if you are using light DOM, but we recommend that for all components where security is key, you use shadow DOM. Now here are the best practices for styling your components. We recommend that you use CSS custom properties for styling your web components, and if you need to override the styling of your base components, then use styling hooks. Again, I want to reiterate that you should favor styling hooks and CSS custom properties because they provide optimized performance and they are standard compared to using component attributes to style your Lightning Web Components. Now, if you want to deep dive into styling your Lightning Web Components, I recommend reading this helpful blog from one of our developer advocates. This blog covers in detail around styling your Lightning Web Components. Alright, in this section, we'll look at some of the error handling patterns for Lightning Web Components. Now, The best practice around error handling pattern is you adopt a common error reporting strategy for your components. And also remember that if your component is not standalone, then make sure that you throw the errors to the parent component. So let me demonstrate one of the error handling patterns that we use in our sample app called LWC recipes. So we create a reusable error panel component that we use across our entire project. Let's take a peek at it. So what you see here is an error panel component. Now this component uses templates for different states, and this error panel component is reused across different components. So we have this one error panel component and we use for our entire project here. So let's take an example of how this is being used. This Apex imperative method component uses the error panel component to display any errors that can occur in this component. In this section, we're going to talk about some of the performance best practices around building Lightning Web Components. Alright, the first best practice is around using Lightning Data Service, or using cache data, or using one of our UI adapters. Now, the advantages by using Lightning Data Service is it has a baked-in cache layer for you. So instead of having your component go back to the server every time, there's a middle layer called cache, so that the data can be retrieved from the cache, avoiding multiple round trips to the server. Next, if you have multiple components retrieving the same data, we recommend that you create a utility component so that the utility component can surface the same data across multiple components here, and you are not trying to query the server multiple number of times for the same information. The next best practice is we recommend that you adopt techniques of progressive disclosure. There are two different techniques underneath it. First one is lazy loading the data. This can be achieved by using some of the standard out-of-box components like tabset that allows you to lazy load the data. So using components like tabset, we don't load all the data at once. Instead, based on the user interaction or when they click on different subtabs, we render that specific data. Similarly, there is other technique called conditionally rendering the components. This can be achieved via different means using directives like if and else, and also by using CSS techniques. Now again, the idea is you don't surface everything at once. Instead, you surface only the information that the user needs at the start of the application, and then based on user interaction, you can start rendering the other parts of the component and the data. Now, if you're using SQL query, we definitely recommend that you fine-tune your SQL queries because they can add performance overhead. There are different tools that Salesforce provides. One of the very popular tool is Query Analyzer. Using the Query Analyzer, you can make sure that the query that you're writing is optimized. Now, if you want to learn in depth about these performance techniques, there is already a dedicated Trailhead module. I've shared the link for this Trailhead module in the video description down below. In this section, we'll discuss the security best practices for building Lightning Web Components. The first thing that I want to recommend is you plan for enabling LWS, which stands for Lightning Web Security for your orgs. Lightning Web Security is more secure than the previous version called Locker Services. They provide additional security by offering built-in capabilities like HTML sanitization, and they block code that violates CSP. CSP stands for Content Security Policy. So make sure that you have a plan in place for enabling LWS. As I said before, LWS is enhanced and is more secure and offers more API compared to its previous version called Locker Services. Now, one other important feature that you get with Lightning Web Security is the Lightning Web Security has support for cross namespace LWC modules, which means if you have two different packages with different namespaces, you can reuse component from one package within another package, even with different namespaces. So this feature gets automatically available to you via LWS. The next best practice is to minimize third-party libraries. Now, the third-party libraries often have security vulnerabilities, so you want to make sure that you're minimizing them. And if you plan to use a third-party library, make sure you use Platform Resource Loader module. There is an example for how to use Platform Resource Loader module in our sample app called LWC Recipes. Alright, so the next security best practice is to adopt principle of least privileges. Now, when you configure events for your Lightning Web components, you have two configuration properties called composable and bubbles. Make sure to keep them false. By keeping both composable false and bubbles false, your events are restricted within the same shadow root. That means they do not propagate the data outside the shadow boundary of the components. So any other component will have to explicitly listen to them. So this prevents the data leakage, and hence it's the best practice to follow the principle of least privileges when you are using events. Alright, now this is a very important security best practice, is make sure you avoid DOM manipulation. If you're using that, there is a directive called LWC manual that you can use on your Lightning Web components to indicate that that specific DOM element can be modified. Now, if you decide to manipulate DOM, we definitely do not recommend any of these APIs like set timeout or interval or eval APIs, because they can create security vulnerabilities in your code.
Finally, I want to encourage you to read the blog post titled Step Up Your LWC Skills. This is our two-part series blog post from one of the members of Lightning Web Component Engineering team. There's a lot of best practices and coding best practices highlighted in this blog. The link for this is shared in the video description below.
Alright, now here we are at the end of our session. I want to take a moment and thank you for listening to this session. And if you have any feedback, do reach out to us via my Twitter handle, msrivastav13. And I hope to see you in the next session.